Right, just going to do a quick video today to answer one of the common objections or confusions leveled at Western astrology, which is why the signs, that's the 12 signs of the zodiac that you can find in every newspaper sun sign column, the Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, those 12, why they don't coincide in the sky with the constellations after which they are named in Western astrology. In Vedic, aka Indian astrology, they do, because they use what is known as sidereal, that's a Latin word meaning stars. They use sidereal astrology, they use the sidereal zodiac. In Western astrology, we don't, and critics of astrology have often assumed this means astrologers don't realize that there is an almost 20-degree discrepancy, a difference between 0 degrees of the sign that we use in astrological calculation and the position of the stars in the sky. Whereas we do realize that, and there are sound philosophical and historical reasons for that discrepancy existing in Western astrology. So I'm just going to go into those. So when astrology was developed around 4,000 years ago, sort of Mesopotamian, Babylonian times, at the time when the sun was seen against the backdrop of the stars of Aries, when the sun entered what is known in sidereal astrology as 0 degrees Aries, it was the spring equinox, i.e. the time of year when the day definitively begins to exceed the night in length in the northern hemisphere, which is where astrology was developed, in the northern hemisphere. So at that time that was the case, and therefore there was no discrepancy between the position of the constellations and the 12 signs of the zodiac. There are only 12. The 13 sign thing is another controversy for another video for another day. The point there was that at that time they were the same. Then as astrology progressed, as time went on, and it got taken up in different parts of the world, in India and in that part of the world, the branch was developed into Vedic astrology, and they stuck with the actual position of the constellations in the sky. What happens over time is, because of a phenomenon that astronomers have named the precession of the equinoxes, which means the Earth slightly tilting on its axis over a period of time relative to the stars as seen from the perspective of the Earth. Basically, because the Earth slightly shifts on its axis over time, the constellations don't seem to stay in the same place, so that now at the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere, when the sun is at what we still call in Western astrology 0 Aries, in sidereal astrology, in Vedic astrology, it's around 20 degrees Pisces, i.e. the constellation behind the sun. If you looked at the sun and had the facility to do that without going blind, if you had that technology, then you would see the constellation Pisces behind it, not Aries. So this shift of the Earth on its axis means that we see a different constellation behind it. The reason this is not important, or not considered to be important in Western astrology, is that the constellations were merely a device for naming, for slicing the sky up into 12 segments of equal size, which were then used symbolically for divinatory purposes. So it was only ever a symbolic division of the sky. And that symbolism was not based on the actual size and dimensions of the constellation. Because here's the thing, the constellations aren't all exactly 30 degrees in size. They're all quite different. So for example, Libra would sprawl over maybe, 40 degrees of a circle, whereas Aries is quite a small one. It would only take up about 15 degrees of a circle. So of the circle of the ecliptic, which is the plane of the Earth's orbit around the sun. In other words, if you sat the sun on a table like a giant beach ball and sliced it in half, sliced the sun in half, sat half of that giant beach ball on a table, and the Earth was a little pea rolling around the sun, that would be the ecliptic. That tabletop would be the ecliptic. Anyway, I digress. The point is, the constellations don't match the signs, that doesn't matter because 0 degrees Aries was so named after the constellation, but it was kept at that point rather than be moved backwards because it needs to be the spring equinox. In other words, the spring equinox is 0 Aries, the summer equinox is 0 Cancer, the autumn equinox is 0 Libra, and the winter equinox is 0 Capricorn. In the northern hemisphere, obviously those seasons will change in the southern hemisphere, but the point is the round of the 12 signs which the sun passes through is actually, although it's named after the constellations which approximately lined up with them 4,000 years ago when astrology originated, the division is actually one of the solar year, and it starts at 0 Aries, where in the northern hemisphere the sun begins spring. In the southern hemisphere, obviously, it's the beginning of autumn, rather, which is another debate for another time, because the sun basically slows down slightly relative to our position to the Earth. Although the Earth is on an approximately spherical orbit around the sun, it is very slightly elliptical. So the days, the time it takes for the sun to traverse 1 degree of the ecliptic is slightly longer from 0 Libra through to 0 Aries, I believe. So even in the southern hemisphere, it could be said that the so-called signs 0 Libra through to 0 Aries, that the time when the sun is moving through those so-called zodiac signs does represent a slightly slower pace, even though in the southern hemisphere it's spring and summer rather than autumn and winter. Anyway, I've banged on a little bit, but hopefully you now understand why in Western astrology it doesn't, the whole point of it is that the zodiac, although it was named after the constellations, doesn't have to be synonymous with the constellations. The actual positions of the stars are still used in astrology when we use fixed stars, which are really important predictive devices. And in that case, all astrologers do take into account this phenomenon of precession, because you need to know the actual real positions of the brightest stars in the sky. So astrologers are well aware of this phenomenon, and we have decided not to move the 12 signs of the zodiac because they were only ever named after the 12 constellations in the first place. They never exactly fit in terms of their dimensions, and the entire division of the ecliptic into 12 equal segments was in fact based on the solar year. Okay?
当我们理解了星象运行的宏观时间，也可以回到自己身上来看星盘，因为每个人都有属于自己的生命周期。或许你正处在某个关键的十字路口，想更清楚看见接下来的人生方向，你应该会好奇，星盘里那些重要的主题究竟会在什么时候被启动？马可士老师这次带来的课程《古典占星主线法》将在6月26日开课。如果把本命盘比喻为人生剧本的蓝图，那么主线法就像是帮助我们看见剧本里那些重要转折会在什么时候展开。主线法能帮助我们观察职业发展、伴侣关系、人生状态等的转折，以及重要事件可能出现的时间点，让我们更清楚地理解属于自己的生命节奏。如果你想进一步了解古典占星的预测逻辑，也想更深入学习如何判断人生重大事件的时间指标，欢迎点击说明处连结，了解课程详情。